Welcome to Western Region Pastors Institute. This is lecture number 4 for the class Exegesis and Hermeneutics. This will correspond with Moises Silva and Walter Kaiser's book Introduction to Biblical Hermeneutics, The Search for Meaning, chapter 8. And I'll be also kind of referencing something that many of you who are listening to this closer to when I first recorded it will remember from our class session, but I want everybody to hear this. So it might be repetition, and again, I'm not picking on anybody. I just want to make some things clear, especially in this part of your study, because this becomes the foundation for the rest of your life in Christ and life in the church, life in ministry, as long as you're dealing with the Bible. And so this becomes kind of one of those foundational courses, and by definition, introductory. And so the learning posture of the student becomes critically important here. The texts that I've selected for this course are standard, basic, they're conservative. So from that perspective, in our culture, in our world, evangelical world, they are fairly, they're non-controversial, maybe I should say it that way. And another word that I might use here as you approach it is that there's really nothing in these books for you to argue with. Mostly when you read How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, you should rest assured that you're okay with a less critical approach to the reading and a more open approach to the reading, which says, I need to learn from these guys these basic hermeneutical and exegetical principles so that I'll have the foundation upon which to make arguments later. I often tell people to read critically, and I still do. I just am saying these are foundational reference books. And so the reference material becomes something you refer back to as authoritative at some level. Now, obviously, as believers, we believe that our authority is God, and that our ability to understand how God has communicated to us is through the scriptures. That being the case, having a foundational work that governs how we deal with determining the truth of the scriptures is critical. Basically, the question that we're grappling with in this class is, how do we understand the texts of the Bible in such a way that we may claim the authority of the Bible with our teaching? And in order to do that, we can't be throwing darts at the text or depending upon our feeling of what feels the best in terms of understanding, but we have to actually be dealing with some sort of objective principles so that we can, with confidence, assert an authority when we state something from the biblical text. And so what we want to do is learn these principles well. And as you do more and more study in the work of exegesis and hermeneutics, then you might enter into the discussion of which of these principles are dispensable or indispensable. Until such a point, you really should focus upon learning these principles and then applying these principles. And then if you move further into the study of the actual work of exegesis and hermeneutics, you then can do some pushing back. But at this point, I would just encourage most of you in this class to just take a learning posture with regard to that. Secondly, I mentioned that one of our challenges today in the evangelical world and in the church is that we start our exegetical and hermeneutical process with homiletics, meaning this, that most of us learned how to do Bible study. Most of us have ingested our teaching from the Bible, from the pulpit. And pastors have a varied level of expertise in dealing with the three critical areas of sermon preparation and delivery. That would be exegesis, hermeneutics, and then homiletics. Homiletics would be the actual movement from the meaning of the text, the application that's derived from that meaning, to the presentation of all of that to a particular audience or congregation. And so homiletics becomes a tool of sermon preparation. If the pastor skips exegesis and hermeneutics and just deals with homiletics, meaning that he just begins his approach to the Bible with, I need a sermon to preach, we often end up with substandard sermons. And that would be the case because, again, just like anything else, we're starting off with the last thing and not the first thing. The sermon must be derived from exegesis and hermeneutics. And when homiletics drives the ship, then oftentimes we shortchange the process. Most of us have been exposed to at least a variation of that process. Most pastors, I would say, struggle with a very rigorous schedule of sermon prep that moves from exegesis to hermeneutics to homiletics in a very formal way. And so what we sometimes are exposed to are homiletics-driven sermons. And that's what we're used to. And then that translates into how we approach the text as well. So this study should kind of turn that on its head for you, especially as you begin to engage as a teacher in trying to present good biblical material, and from which you can with confidence assert that this is authoritative. This is what the Bible teaches about this matter. And that becomes the critical part. All right, well, your reading for last week and the reading from, or the lecture for today, both deal with the Old Testament narrative and the meaning for narrative. And just to make my point, if you were to read both of these works side by side, you would see a lot of congruence in what they've said. And so just let me summarize a little bit of what, or how Kaiser has presented the meaning and gleaning the meaning or understanding the meaning of narrative. He makes the same statement that Fee and Stewart make, that narrative makes up a large portion of the Bible's content, that the most common genre in the Bible is narrative. So understanding how to deal with narrative becomes important and a critical part of your toolbox in terms of Bible study and Bible teaching. Narrative, as opposed to a teaching portion, a sermon of Jesus, or an epistle, presents its principles and its purposes indirectly, which means it uses a story theme or a story to be the vehicle with which it communicates a principle. And in many ways, we want to approach the narratives the same way we approach parables, where we would seek for a big idea and see how that's taught in that narrative or in that story. And so that becomes kind of a guiding principle. Narrative style derives from its use of selection. Every author who tells a story is going to look at the details of that story and pick and choose the details. They aren't exhaustive presentations of what's happening, but they're selected. The author selects from a large number of details that could have been selected for any story or event that's described. The author also arranges them in a particular order. He arranges them, and the characters that he selects, he arranges them and puts them in a particular light, connects them in a certain way. And then he uses rhetorical devices. All of those things form the structure of a narrative. And when we seek for those kinds of structures, we begin to get hints at what the author is intending to tell us through the telling of the story. The literary devices that are found in narrative are as follows. First, we have the scene. And as you remember from your reading in Fee and Stewart, the scene becomes the important part, especially in the Hebrew narrative. And the author of stories or a book, typically if he's telling you the book mostly in story or narrative form, is going to move you from scene to scene. And interestingly enough, each scene usually has no more than 2 characters. When you have a group of people in a scene, oftentimes they represent one of those 2 characters. But typically the scenes are made up of 2 characters. And one of the most notable features of the scenes of the biblical narrative is the presence of God. So oftentimes God is one of those characters in the scene. Sometimes it's not the actual presence of God, but God as mediated through a prophet per se, or so to say. The prophet would be a stand-in for God in that scene. And so the scene is a very important literary device in the narrative. Another literary device in narratives is what we call the point of view. And typically the author is the one who presents the point of view. And at some point, what he might do to express his point of view is to have the main character of the story in dialogue present the point of view. And this would be what we call the focal point or the big idea. Another literary device in the narrative form is dialogue. And so you want to note where dialogue interrupts the story, where it interrupts the flow. It becomes an important part of that whole process of dialogue, or of the point of the narrative. And dialogue is one of the ways in which the narrator characterizes people and characterizes who they are and what they stand for. Some of the rhetorical devices that are used in narrative are repetition. And you want to be aware of repetition, whether it's words or phrases. You want to kind of note those things when they are repeated. The author is obviously making a point. Other things that are repeated are actions, or images, or motifs, or themes, or ideas. Another rhetorical device in narrative is what's called inclusio, and it's a form of repetition. But basically, inclusio is the kind of repetition that serves as a bracket. So passages of scripture will begin with a statement and end with a very similar statement, and it marks off the material that belongs together. And lastly, another rhetorical device in narrative is what we were introduced to in, I think, Old Testament. We talked a lot about chiasm. And chiasm is a literary structure, a poetic structure. If you remember, we talked about A, B, C, C, B, A, that kind of repetition and movement of correspondence between the statement and a narrative. So that would be another one of the rhetorical devices that's used. The most things that Silva and Kaiser put into play that was a little bit different in their presentation, basically stating the same sort of things, but maybe it's helpful to put it a different way for understanding's sake, is the different structural levels in a narrative. So for instance, there's the verbal level. The verbal level would just include the words and the phrases that were used. And so if we look for a repetition, for instance, at the verbal level in Genesis chapter 1, you have each and every day the repetition. There was evening, and then there was morning, day 1. You have the repetition of the words, it was good. And so at that verbal level, we just have some observations about repetition, and we can make that observation at that level. That helps us to begin to frame the meaning of the passage, or what the author is intending for us to see there. Other things that you want to be aware of at the verbal level are just simple usages of things like metaphor and simile, unusual grammatical and syntactical constructions, Those kinds of things you want to be aware of if you can note them. And just, they, again, at the verbal level, begin to frame the meaning of the passage. So that's one level. The second level would be the level of narrative technique. And so an author might use different kinds of techniques to drive home his point. So for instance, one of them would be interspersing dialogue and narrative. And the way that an author does that you want to be aware of, because it will highlight what he's getting at. Narration versus description. Sometimes an author will stop to describe something as opposed to continue the narration. And then sometimes an author will actually make a comment or even an explanation in the middle of the narration as he presents the scenes, summaries of actions, those kinds of things. So we want to be aware of the level of narrative technique that is presented in a particular story. A third level in narrative is the level of the narrative world. This would include the actual characters and the events, the spatial and temporal references. I don't mean anything by this, but I think one of the ways that narrative should be read is more like when we read fiction, not saying that they're fictional accounts, but more like when we read fiction. The narrative in the Old Testament has some of those kinds of flavors to it, where the author of a book of fiction is constructing a picture for us by which we would draw conclusions. So for instance, I don't know how many of you have read The Great Gatsby or are familiar with The Great Gatsby, but when I read The Great Gatsby, I just kind of read the story. And when I first read The Great Gatsby in high school, I thought it was a very boring story. When my sons read The Great Gatsby, when we forced them to read The Great Gatsby at home, we tried to find a little more deeper meaning to the book so that we could actually teach them how the book was written. When they finally arrived in college and discovered all the different meanings and usages of colors and lights and different things in that book, they came back with a totally different perspective. So whereas in high school our boys probably said, I really didn't like that book, in college, after they read the book and had some of these ideas that were presented in the narrative world of The Great Gatsby, when they started understanding some of these pictures that were being painted, some of the temporal, the spatial references, the character development, the events, the linking of characters, the climax, possible multiple climaxes in the plot line, the reversals in the plot line, the twists and the turns. When they finally began to see all of those things, then the book's meaning actually came to life, and they had a greater understanding of it. And I think sometimes when we read the biblical narratives, we want to read them as kind of bald history, where events are just being described to us in kind of a linear fashion. Whereas the biblical authors use those historical events and accounts with a more fictional flair to them in terms of putting the stories together in such a way that they were repeatable, that they were told around the table, or in the context of the meeting of the people, or if we use our classic picture, the campfire. They had that kind of a level to them as well. That's not an attack on their historicity. That's a whole other question altogether. It's just a way of thinking about the stories as you begin to try to dissect and understand them. So when we talk about the structural level of a narrative, and we call it the narrative world that the author has constructed with these events and characters and people, I think that's a good way to approach it, just from a standpoint of trying to understand it, because they're using some of the same literary techniques that a person who wrote fiction would use to convey their message and their story. The final level, structural level in a narrative, is the level of conceptual content. And this level focuses on themes, which are expressed in short phrases, or on ideas, which can come in the form of complete sentences. So themes set forth the central issues of the narrative, while ideas point to the lesson, message, or teaching that is found in the narrative. So you want to kind of highlight and identify those. Maybe just in brief, we talk about some of the themes and ideas that run through the book of Genesis. One of the things you'll notice as a repetition, not of words, but of events, is that in the book of Genesis, there is a repetition of a rejection of the firstborn and a selection of the secondborn. So throughout the narrative of Genesis, you see this. You should notice this. The difference between Cain and Abel. Abel seems to be the preferred. Jacob and Esau. Esau seems to be preferred. Even if I move back and talk about Isaac and Ishmael, Ishmael is technically, although not of Sarah, Abraham's firstborn. But Isaac is the chosen one. So Esau and Jacob, Esau is the older, Jacob is the chosen one. Joseph is not the secondborn, but he's also not the firstborn, but he's the chosen one. So you have this repetition of the overlooking of the firstborn and the selection of the secondborn or the laterborn. There's a repetition or an idea that should cause you to step back and say, what's being said in this repetition? Is this significant? Is it interesting? Another one would be the idea of provision that is repeated throughout the book of Genesis. So in the Abraham story, he leaves his land in hopes of God providing a new land, a new place for him to dwell, which he does. Isaac goes to look for a wife, and God provides that wife. The main provision that we see is also in the Joseph story, where God plans for the well-being of his people through the Joseph story. He provides for them in the end. And the whole scene of the brothers and Jacob coming to Egypt is one of provision. So again, there is a repeated idea. And I think you'll find that the phrase, well, the one I left out of that whole thing was when Abraham takes Isaac up to be sacrificed. And Isaac asks him, where's the lamb? Where is our sacrifice? Abraham uses that phrase, God will provide. So those are two examples of how in the greater narrative of the whole book of Genesis, the idea of repetition, both conceptually and with words or ideas and themes, can be raised to start thinking about what is the message of these stories, what is the message of the book as a whole. And so you begin to see how I'm not going to take this and use it as independent stories about moral lessons to be learned in each of these independent stories. But as I start putting them together and stepping back and looking at the big picture, I'm going to get a picture of the message of the book as a whole, as it leads to or lends itself to the whole redemptive story. All right, that concludes this lecture.